The night began like a fairy tale and ended like a ghost story. It was the summer of 1991 in Grayford, the kind of town where the air still carried the scent of freshly cut hay at night, and the streets rolled empty by 9 p.m. except for the occasional flicker of a porch light. But tonight the lights burned brighter, and later in the banquet hall at the far edge of Main Street, music pulsed against the glass windows, laughter spilled into the parking lot, and two people barely past their mid-20s danced as if the rest of the world had disappeared. David and Lila Harrow, the newest Mr. and Mrs. in Grayford. The reception hall glowed with soft amber lights strung across wooden beams. Round tables, each wrapped in white linen, were crowded with family and friends who had seen them grow from awkward teenagers into two people so deeply entangled in each other's lives that no one could remember a time when they weren't together. Outside, the air was thick with the sweet perfume of roses from Lilith's bouquet, the petals now beginning to curl at the edges after hours of photographs, toasts, and embraces. Somewhere in the corner of the room, a man watched through the lens of a camera. Henry Calloway wasn't the type to insert himself into celebrations. He was a quiet presence at every wedding. He worked, a man who let his images speak instead of his voice. His camera was a black, heavy Nikon F, for its metal worn from hours of use. All night it had clicked in steady rhythm, preserving the fleeting expressions of joy, surprise, and tenderness as the couple moved from table to table. Now, as the clock neared midnight, he framed his next shot, the champagne toast. The moment was small and unassuming. David leaning close to Lila, whispering something only she could hear, her eyes closing for half a second, the corners of her mouth lifting. Then the glasses touched with the delicate chime of crystal, the sound swallowed by the murmur of the crowd. The flash ignited, bleaching the room white, for an instant freezing their faces in a frame that would unknowingly become historic. At the time, nothing felt unusual. No one sensed the undercurrent. A few more songs played. Guests began to trickle out, the older relatives first, their shoes clicking on the polished floor, murmuring their goodnights. By 12:20 a.m., the music softened, the laughter thinned, and the couple made their way toward the door. Lilith's veil had been removed hours earlier, replaced with a loose twist of hair pinned with gardenias. David's tie hung slack around his neck, his jacket folded over one arm. Henry took one last photograph as they paused under the fairy lights that lined the exit. The bulbs hummed faintly in the quiet. David bent down to kiss Lilith's temple. Her eyes darted to something over his shoulder just for a second, and then they were gone, stepping out into the night air. The door swung shut behind them. In the weeks that followed that sound, the muted thud of the reception hall door, would play over and over in Henry's mind, because no one saw them again after that. But in that exact moment, the only thing Henry noticed was the way the shadows clung a little too tightly to the far end of the parking lot. He adjusted his lens to capture one final shot before packing up the frame, caught nothing unusual: empty pavement, the glow of a lone street lamp, and the black ribbon of road stretching toward the woods. At least, that's what he thought at the time. Years later, when the negatives were pulled from their envelope for the first time in decades, Henry's hands trembled in the background of that seemingly empty parking lot between two cars. A faint silhouette could be seen, blurred, watching. But on that summer night in 1991, Henry lowered his camera, wound the last roll of film, and told himself he was imagining things. The final toast had been made, the dance floor was empty, and somewhere beyond the reach of the fairy lights, the Newlyweds were already slipping into the pages of a story no one would believe. The smell of chemicals clung to the air, sharp, metallic, and faintly sweet. Henry Calloway worked in the darkroom the way other men prayed in churches, slow, deliberate, with a kind of reverence. The door was locked, the blinds drawn, the only light a deep blood-red glow spilling from the safe light above his workbench. Outside, the world was already waking to the news. Inside, time was measured not in hours, but in the gradual blooming of images across water-stained paper. It was 3 days after the wedding. The police had already come by asking for any photos from the reception, anything that might help. Henry had nodded, promising to prepare them. But there was a reason he hadn't yet handed over the last roll. The first prints slid into focus in the developer tray. Faces emerged from nothingness, a hand raised mid-wave, a child crouched under a table, the gleam of a ring catching the light. He worked silently, moving each image through the chemical baths with gentle precision, his gloved hands trembling just enough to ripple the surface of the water. Then came the frame from the final toast. Henry paused, leaning closer. The bride and groom stood at the center, their glasses raised, their expressions illuminated in pure joy. But it wasn't them that held his attention, it was the space just behind their shoulders, a smear of shadow near the open doorway darker than it should have been even in the dim light of the hall. He blinked, shook his head, and told himself it was nothing. Shadows had a way of lying in photographs. Still, he set the print aside, separate from the others. The next frames felt heavier somehow, the couple leaving under the string lights, the way the bride's gaze slipped over her husband's shoulder for a fraction of a second, a candid shot of the parking lot as they walked toward their car. At least the car he assumed was theirs. He didn't remember why had even taken it. The image felt accidental, like his finger had clicked the shutter on its own. In the background between two parked sedans, the faint outline of a figure seemed to bend forward as if stepping out from the shadows. Henry's stomach tightened. He moved the print under the enlarger, adjusting the focus, trying to bring the shape into clarity, but the more he tried, the less certain he became. Was it a trick of the light, a smudge on the lens, or had someone truly been standing there watching? The negatives didn't lie, at least that's what he used to believe. By the time the prints were dry, Henry knew he couldn't bring himself to hand them over. Not all of them, not yet. He delivered the expected set to the police, the smiling family portraits, the dance floor candids, the bouquet toss caught midair, and kept the final strip locked in a small metal box in his studio for the next 30 years. Had opened that box maybe once every few years just to make sure it was still there. The photos never changed, but his memory of the night did. Sometimes he swore he remembered seeing movement at the far end of the lot. Other times, he told himself, had imagined it entirely. And then there was the phone call. It came a week after the wedding, when the story was still front page news. Henry had been in the kitchen pouring coffee when the phone rang. The voice on the other end was low, almost inaudible, like someone speaking through a scarf. You didn't see anything, the voice said. Henry froze, the receiver pressed to his ear. Who is this? You didn't see anything. The line went dead. For years, he kept that moment folded away in the back of his mind, alongside the images he couldn't bring himself to show, not out of fear for himself, but because of what those photographs might mean, not just for the case, but for the families still living in Grayford, families whose secrets ran deep into the roots of the town. Still, every time Henry passed the framed wedding portrait that hung in the town's diner, the one where David's arm curled protectively around Lilith's waist, he felt the same quiet dread that somewhere in those images the truth was still looking back at him. Grayford, Pennsylvania wasn't the kind of place you found on accident. It was a dot on a road map tucked between low wooded hills and the slow ribbon of the Marin River. In 1991, it had 2 traffic lights, a diner called Rubus, a hardware store that doubled as the town's gossip mill, and a single brick church whose steeple could be seen from every direction. The streets curled in tight loops lined with porches where old men drank coffee from chipped mugs and waved at the mailman. People here didn't just know each other's names, they knew each other's debts, heartbreaks, and quiet mistakes. The Harrows and the Dunns, David's and Lilith's families were Grayford fixtures. David's father ran the hardware store. Lilith's mother taught 3rd grade for 30 years and could recite the birthdays of every student she'd ever had. The marriage had been the kind of union small towns thrived on, not just 2 people in love, but 2 family trees grafted together in the eyes of the community. The wedding had been anticipated for months. It was all anyone talked about in Rubus Diner that spring, from the brand of champagne to the rumor that Lilith's dress had been custom-made in Philadelphia. It was going to be the event of the decade in Grayford, the kind of thing people would point to years later as a golden memory. And for a while it was. Neighbors described the day as perfect. The ceremony in the church was small, intimate, with sunlight falling in long beams through the stained glass. The reception hall had been transformed with soft gold light and pale roses, the air thick with music and the smell of roast chicken. Kids darted between tables, old friends clinked glasses, and Henry Calloway's camera clicked quietly in the background, stitching the night together frame by frame. But the beauty of Grayford, its close-knit warmth, was also its darkness. Secrets didn't stay buried, they simply settled into the soil, waiting for the right season to rise again. There were tensions no one spoke of at the wedding. People noticed who was seated next to whom and who wasn't invited at all. A few guests, it was whispered, hadn't been on speaking terms with the families in years. An uncle with a gambling problem, a cousin who'd left town after a scandal. They all came back for the wedding, their smiles polite but brittle. When David and Lila disappeared, Grayford closed ranks on the surface. It was all hands on deck, neighbors volunteering for search parties, business owners printing missing posters for free, the church holding candlelight vigils. But under that, in the hushed corners of the diner and the aisles of the hardware store, whispers spread like wildfire. They never even left town, one woman said over coffee. I heard they ran off, a man muttered near the church steps. Her family knows more than they're saying. Someone else insisted the police worked methodically, but Grayford wasn't used to tragedy. Without resolution in most small-town crises, a fire, a car accident, a farm lost to foreclosure, there was a clear cause and a name to blame. But with David and Lila, there was nothing but absence. The days after the disappearance were heavy with stillness. The streets seemed emptier. Rubus Diner played its radio at a lower volume. The church bells sounded louder against the quiet. Henry noticed something else too. Every time he walked down Main Street, he could feel eyes on him. Some looks were curious, others cautious. He knew what they were, wondering why the photographer hadn't given the police every frame from that night. Of course they didn't know had kept anything back, but in Grayford, intuition often ran ahead of proof. By the end of the first week, the town's unity began to crack. People started drawing invisible lines, siding with one family or the other, or retreating entirely from the conversation. Those who had loved the Newlyweds spoke about them in the past tense, as if bracing for bad news. Those who hadn't liked them said less, but their silence carried its own weight. For all its charm, Grayford was a place where stories could be rewritten in a single conversation over pie and coffee, and already the story of David and Lila Harrow was shifting from tragedy to cautionary tale, from fact to something stranger, harder to pin down, because in Grayford, memories weren't just what happened, they were what people agreed to remember. And as the summer of 1991 drew on, fewer and fewer people seemed willing to remember the truth. It began with a song the DJ had just queued up, the last slow number of the night, Unchained Melody, a choice that now felt loaded with irony. The reception hall had thinned to maybe 40 guests. The older relatives had already made their way home. The younger crowd swayed lazily on the dance floor, couples holding each other as if the world outside the music didn't exist. David and Lila danced in the center, his hands at her waist, hers looped around his neck. The way they looked at each other, even in that final hour, was the way people wanted to believe love could last forever. At 12:07 a.m., the music faded. The DJ announced it was time to wrap things up. There were hugs at the door, laughter spilling into the cool night air. The official timeline would later list the moment the couple left the hall as 12:14 a.m. Witnesses recalled them stepping under the canopy of fairy lights, stopping to wave goodbye to the last group lingering at the door. Henry Calloway's camera clicked one final time from there. The story splits. Witness account 1. The blue sedan. Margaret Latimer, a cousin of the groom, swore she saw David unlock a pale blue sedan parked near the street. She remembered the click of the locks and the way the taillights glowed red as they pulled away. She even recalled the first turn they took west toward the lake house, where they were meant to spend the night. The police found no trace of that car. David owned a pickup truck, not a sedan, and no blue sedan was ever connected to the couple. Witness account 2. On foot to the lake. Todd and Melanie Rivers, friends from Lila's childhood, claimed they saw the couple walking hand-in-hand down the gravel path behind the reception hall toward the lake. Todd remembered teasing David about wasting no time as they passed. Melanie swore she saw Lila carrying her bouquet, but the bouquet had been found hours earlier lying in the reception hall kitchen, its stems already wilting. Witness account 3. The roadside glass. Officer Greg Hall, the first on the scene after the disappearance was reported, recalled seeing a broken champagne flute by the roadside about a mile from the hall. He assumed it was a remnant from the reception until he noticed there was still liquid in it, a pale gold, catching the light of his flashlight. Tests later confirmed it was champagne whose glass it was. No one knew. A fragment of audio. In 1991, home video cameras were still bulky, loud things reserved for birthdays and graduations, but one guest, a college friend of David's named Trevor, had been filming throughout the night. When investigators reviewed the footage, they found something odd near the very end. As the couple is leaving the hall, a faint metallic clang echoes from the distance. David glances over his shoulder briefly. Lila's smile falters for half a second, then they step out of frame. Trevor swore he didn't hear the sound at the time. The last known interaction at 12:17 a.m. Another guest, 19-year-old Paige Evers, remembered speaking briefly to the couple just outside the hall. She had been waiting for her ride, shivering in the night air. When they approached, David joked about disappearing into married life, and Lila laughed. Paige remembered the way the bride glanced toward the far end of the parking lot, her hand tightening on David's arm. The couple walked away. Paige's ride pulled up moments later. That was the last confirmed sighting. By 1:30 a.m., the reception hall was locked up and dark. The DJ packed his equipment into his van. The catering crew loaded crates into the back of a truck, and the fairy lights flickered off one row at a time. The night sank into silence when neither David nor Lila arrived at the lake house. By morning, their families assumed they'd decided to spend the night elsewhere, maybe in a hotel on a whim, but by noon calls to both their parents went unanswered. At 2:45 p.m., David's mother reported them missing. The search began almost immediately. Police retraced the possible routes from the hall to the lake, combing through roadside ditches and wooded shoulders. They interviewed guests again, comparing stories and timelines, but instead of narrowing the possibilities, the accounts only widened them. In some versions, the couple left in a hurry. In others, they lingered, talking quietly near the tree. Nothing concrete emerged, no tire tracks matching their truck, no footprints leading toward the lake, no sign of a struggle, and no clear evidence they'd ever made it past the parking lot. The champagne flute, the sound on the video, the bouquet abandoned in the kitchen, all fragments without a center. Henry Calloway didn't offer the police the photographs from the final minutes that night, not the one with the smear of shadow behind the doorway, not the parking lot shot with the faint outline between the sedans. When asked, he simply said his last roll was still drying. What he didn't admit, not then, not for years, was that he hadn't been able to sleep since developing them, that every time he closed his eyes, he saw the way Lilith's gaze had shifted in those last seconds, as if she were seeing something no one else could, something or someone waiting for them just beyond the reach of the light. By dawn on the second day, the search had moved to the lake. The Murren was not a grand body of water, more a widening of the river bordered by tall reeds and silver birch trees, whose roots twisted into the shoreline like arthritic fingers in summer. Its surface was a polished mirror, broken only by the occasional leap of a fish or the wake of a passing canoe. But in the early hours of that morning, it looked like a sheet of tarnished metal. The police set up a command post near the old boathouse. Volunteers from the town milled about, their breath steaming in the cool air, paper cups of coffee warming their hands. Dogs barked from the backs of pickup trucks, straining against their leashes, their handlers holding them back until the search began. From the docks, Henry watched quietly, his camera left at home. It didn't feel right to bring it now, not when every face he might capture would be carved from worry. The search team started at 8 a.m. Sharp boats pushed away from the shore, their engines low and careful, leaving ripples that spread outward in slow concentric circles. Officers leaned over the gunwales, eyes scanning the water for anything, a scrap of fabric, the glint of metal, the pale shape of a body just beneath the surface. The drag lines went in, the sound was methodical, almost hypnotic. Ropes pulling, taut nets slicing through the water, the heavy clunk of the winches every few minutes. The silence was broken by the call of a location number over the radio. Another section of the lake marked off as searched and cleared, but the lake gave them nothing. By noon, the sun was high enough to glint off the waves, turning the surface into 1,000 shards of light. The heat rose, and with it the low murmur of conversation among the volunteers. Some wondered aloud why the couple would have been near the lake at all. Others insisted that was the only place they could have gone. Henry overheard fragments. Maybe they fell in. No, not both of them. Then someone made sure of it. The water didn't care which version they believed. That afternoon, divers went in the lake, swallowed them in slow green gulps. Each time they surfaced, their masks dripping, their heads shook. No wedding clothes, no car keys, no rings. By the end of the day, the officers were damp and exhausted, their uniforms smelling faintly of algae and gasoline. The reeds along the shore swayed in the breeze, a rustling like whispers. Just beyond hearing, the only sign of life was a blue heron standing motionless in the shallows, its thin shadow stretching toward the deeper water. And still the Murren kept its secrets. As the search dragged on into the week, the lake became more than just a location. It became a presence in the town's imagination, something ancient and patient, willing to hold on to what it took. The vigils began on the shoreline. Families brought candles in glass jars, setting them in rows along the dock. The wind would knock some over, sending wax pooling across the wood like spilled milk. Prayers were whispered into the dusk, their words carried away by the gentle lapping of water against the pilings. Henry went once standing apart from the others. He thought about the photographs locked away in his studio, the images that might change how people looked at this place, how they looked at each other, and he wondered for the first time if keeping them hidden was protecting the truth or protecting himself. On the fifth day, a fisherman reported something strange near the far bend of the river, a pale shimmer just below the surface, too bright to be driftwood. Boats went out immediately. They returned an hour later with only a tangled fishing net and a piece of lace waterlogged and gray. The lace was sent to the lab. Weeks later, the results would come back, not from Lilith's dress, not from anything the couple had owned, just another ghost from the water. The lake search ended without a single piece of hard evidence. The official word was that there was no sign of the Newlyweds in or near the water. The unofficial feeling in town was that the lake knew more than it would ever tell, and when the divers packed up and drove away, the water went still again. The heron returned to its post. The reeds swayed, the sunlight flickered across the surface as though nothing at all had disturbed it. In Grayford, people stopped talking about the search, but they did not stop glancing toward the lake when they passed it, as if half expecting, half dreading to see something resurface. The sound of running water filled the room, steady and low like a faraway river. Henry Calloway stood at his workbench, sleeves rolled, the air around him dense with the sour-sweet scent of developer and fixer. The blinds were drawn tight, the red safe light burned overhead, casting everything in the color of old blood. Outside, the summer cicadas screamed. Inside, time was measured in seconds of exposure and the slow ghosting of images on a paper. It was 2 weeks since the wedding, 2 weeks since David and Lila Harrow had stepped out of the reception hall and into the blank space of history. 2 weeks since Henry had promised himself had processed the final role, and 2 weeks since had broken that promise, letting it sit untouched on the shelf above his desk. He told himself had been busy. He told himself the police already had enough photographs to work with, but the truth was simpler and heavier. Henry was afraid of what the negatives might show. That night he could no longer resist. He loaded the film into the enlarger, his fingers moving with the muscle memory of decades, the crinkle of cellophane like brittle leaves underfoot. The first frame was familiar, the champagne toast, Lila mid-laugh, David leaning and glasses raised, but there it was again, a shadow in the open doorway behind them, a smudge darker than the wall, shaped almost, but not quite like a man. Henry adjusted the focus, the grain of the film resolving into sharper detail. The shadow's edges were blurred, as though it were moving. The more he stared, the more certain he became that it was not a trick of the light. He moved on. The next frame showed the couple under the string lights, David's lips brushing Lilith's temple. Her eyes, caught in the split second before the shutter closed, were not on him. They were somewhere beyond him, looking past his shoulder into the night. Her smile was there, but thin like paper over flame. Henry's pulse quickened. He felt a prickling at the back of his neck, the same sensation had had that night when he lowered his camera for the last time. And then came the frame he had not seen since the wedding. It was an accidental shot, the kind you take without meaning to, when your finger brushes the shutter while adjusting the lens. The parking lot lay half in darkness, the pavement glistening faintly from the humidity. 2 sedans sat under the reach of the street lamp, their windshields catching the light in dull reflection. Between them something stood. It was not entirely visible. The frame caught only part of it, a shoulder and arm, the edge of a face turned just enough to catch the light. The rest was swallowed by shadow. Henry felt his throat tighten. He stepped closer, the photograph trembling in his hands. It could have been a trick of the shadows. It could have been a guest. It could have been. The phone rang. The sound made him flinch, nearly dropping the print into the rinse tray. He let it ring twice before picking up. The voice was the same one had heard a week after the wedding, low, muffled, almost without breath. "You didn't see anything?" Henry's mouth went dry. "Who is this?" A pause, then softer. "They didn't suffer." The line clicked dead. Henry stood for a long time in the red light, the words hanging in the air like smoke. He thought about calling the police, but what would he say? That someone he couldn't identify had told him twice to forget what had seen, that a blur in a photograph might be more than it seemed. He slipped the last strip of negatives into a manila envelope, sealed it, and placed it inside the small metal box in his studio. He locked the box, slid it onto the highest shelf, and covered it with an old wool blanket. For the next 30 years, that's where it stayed. He never printed those images for the families, never showed them to anyone. Sometimes, when the case was mentioned in the papers or whispered about in the diner, he'd think about the figure between the sedans, the thin line of Lilith's mouth, the voice on the phone, and he'd wonder if the truth was locked in that box, or if the truth was better off locked away. Rumors in Grayford traveled like smoke. They drifted, curled, and left a smell long after the fire was gone. The figure in Henry's photograph, though unseen by the public, had a way of existing in the collective imagination. Henry never described him to anyone, but the town seemed to invent him on its own, filling in details the way water fills a hollow. Some saw a stranger in their mind's eye, others a familiar face they could never quite name. Within months of the wedding, 3 main stories emerged, none proven, all stubborn. The drifter, the first theory, pointed to a man no one really knew, had been spotted at the gas station 2 days before the wedding wearing a tattered coat. Despite the July heat, a stranger with a slow smile and no clear destination. The cashier remembered him asking for directions to the lake, but not buying gas. Someone else swore they saw him sitting in the diner for hours without ordering more than a coffee. By the time police tried to track him down, he was gone. In a place like Grayford, where even newcomers became familiar in a week, a man who appeared and vanished that quickly stuck in the mind, especially when two people disappeared just after the ex-lover. The second rumor was more personal. It claimed the shadow belonged to a man from Lilith's past, someone Shed dated briefly before meeting David. According to the whispers, Head left town suddenly after their breakup, only to return the week of the wedding. No one could agree on his name, but they all agreed on his motive. Jealousy. In this version, Head lingered outside the reception, watching, waiting. The problem with the theory was that no one could find proof Head been in Grayford at all, yet that didn't stop his name, or what people thought was his name, from being traded in hushed tones over coffee and pie. The cousin, who left early. The last theory was the one people spoke of least, but with the most weight in their voices. One of David's cousins, Carl, had reportedly slipped out of the reception before the dancing ended. He told police had gone home early because of a migraine. The thing was, no one remembered seeing him leave, and when pressed about where Head been at the exact time the Newlyweds were last seen, his answers grew vague. Carl moved to another state within the year, which some took as a sign of guilt. Others argued it was the natural result of being unfairly suspected. None of these stories were proven, none tied directly to the evidence, what little there was. But in Grayford, evidence mattered less than repetition. The more a story was told, the truer it became. Henry kept to himself, his metal box gathering dust in the studio. But as the years passed, he found himself scanning crowds, without meaning to, looking for certain shoulders, certain stances that matched the sliver of figure in the photograph. It was pointless. 30 years could change a man beyond recognition, but the instinct persisted. When the case came up in conversation, it was always in careful tones, such a shame, people would say, or they were too young. But there was always the unspoken addendum, and someone in this town knows why. The town never shook the feeling that the man in the photograph was real. Even though most had never seen the image, it was as if they could sense him, not in the details, but in the gaps, the missing answers, the inconsistencies in memory, the spaces between what was said and what was kept quiet. The truth about Grayford was simple and terrible. If the man in the photograph was one of their own, they'd rather not know, because knowing meant deciding what to do about it, and some truths were more dangerous than ignorance. Winter had settled hard over Grayford, the kind that pressed snow into the seams of doors and froze the Murren River into dull, cracked glass. Most mornings the streets were empty, save for the muffled shuffle of boots and the exhaust ghosts curling from old trucks. Henry Calloway was 79 years old and no longer steady on his feet. His hands, once precise enough to thread film into a camera without looking, now trembled as he poured his morning coffee. The darkroom, untouched for years, smelled faintly of dust and vinegar. The red safe light still hung overhead, but its glow was weaker now, dimmed with age. The metal box sat on the highest shelf, exactly where Head left it 30 years ago. It was the chest pain that decided him. The doctors had been clear his heart was failing, and there wasn't much time. Henry didn't fear dying, not exactly what he feared was leaving something unfinished in the box with its strip of film, and the photographs no one else had seen felt like the heaviest unfinished thing in his life. He took it down one quiet afternoon. The blanket had thrown over it was stiff with dust. The lock was small, the key still taped to the underside of the shelf. It opened with a click that sounded far too loud in the silence. The photographs were just as he remembered: the champagne toast, the fairy lights, the parking lot. And in that parking lot, framed the figure between the sedans, still a blur, still a question. Henry sat for a long time, the prints spread out before him. Before picking up the phone, he called a journalist named Claire Benton, whose work had been following for years. She specialized in cold cases, the kind that other reporters had long given up on. Her stories were methodical, almost forensic, but with a human core, the kind of writing that made you feel the weight of the loss as much as the facts. When Claire answered, Henry told her he had something Shed want to see. He didn't say what. Not over the phone. She agreed to drive down from Pittsburgh that weekend. The snow was falling in soft, steady sheets when she arrived. Claire was in her 30s, sharpied, her hair pulled back tight under a knit cap. She carried a leather satchel that looked as worn as Henry's own camera bag. He led her into the darkroom. She didn't speak as he laid out the photographs one by one across the workbench. Her eyes moved over them slowly, methodically, and then stopped on the parking lot shot. That's the last image before they disappeared, she asked. Henry nodded. She leaned closer, her breath fogging slightly in the cool air. And no one else has seen this? No one, Henry said. Not even the families. Claire was quiet for a moment, then asked the question Henry had been dreading. Why not? He told her about the phone calls, about the voice telling him he hadn't seen anything, about the words they didn't suffer. Her expression didn't change, but he could tell she was filing the detail away, slotting it somewhere important in the architecture of the story. That evening, Claire scanned the negatives into her laptop. Technology had come a long way since 1991. The grain of the film became sharper, the shadows cleaner. When she zoomed in on the figure between the sedans, the blur took on edges, a slant to the shoulders, the suggestion of a hat brim, not enough to identify, but enough to say with certainty, this was a person, not a trick of light. Henry watched the image grow clearer on her screen, and with it came an unexpected feeling, not relief, but grief, because clarity didn't undo the years. Clarity didn't bring David and Lila back. Claire stayed the night in a small room at the inn on Main Street. By morning, the snow had stopped, and she left with the photographs carefully wrapped in brown paper. She promised to dig into the case to see what 30 years of silence might have buried. Henry stood at the window as she drove away, the snow crunching under her tires. He had the strange sense that had set something loose, something that might not come back the way he wanted it to. In the diner that afternoon, the regulars noticed the stranger with the camera bag, asking questions. By the time Claire left town, people were already whispering again. Grayford, it seemed, was about to remember. The first crack in the case didn't come from 1991, it came from 2008. Claire was 3 weeks into her research when she found a buried local newspaper clipping about an engagement party in Grayford that had ended in another disappearance. The headline was small, almost forgettable: couple missing after celebration. Search underway. The names were different, the circumstances eerily familiar. In September 2008, Emily Shore and Mark Beaton had been engaged for just 4 months when their friends hosted a party at a lakeside lodge, a place less than 2 miles from the old 1991 reception hall. They left just after midnight. The last sighting was of them walking toward the parking lot. They never made it home. Claire drove back to Grayford to visit the retired detective who'd worked that case. Frank Morales' hair was white now, his shoulders stooped, but his eyes were sharp. It was the same damn thing, Morales said, flipping through a file so worn the edges curled. A happy couple, an evening full of people who swore they saw nothing unusual, and then gone. He slid a grainy security still across the table. The lodge had one exterior camera in 2008 mounted near the main entrance. The image was dark, the lot lit only by a single bulb, but there at the far left of the frame between 2 vehicles was a shape. Claire leaned closer. The build, the angle, the way the head turned toward the departing couple, it was almost identical to the figure in Henry's 1991 photograph. You see it too, Morales said. Claire nodded. The similarities went beyond the images. In both cases, the couple disappeared within minutes of leaving the building. The last known location was within walking distance of the Murren's Edge. No vehicle was ever confirmed. The final witness accounts contradicted each other in subtle but critical ways, and in both cases no bodies were found. Claire began interviewing anyone still in town who remembered 2008. Most were reluctant. A few insisted there was nothing to connect the 2 events, but some lowered their voices and admitted the truth. They'd noticed the parallels even back then. They just didn't talk about it. The reason? Fear, not of the figure itself, but of what it might mean if it was the same person across nearly 2 decades. If it is the same man, one former lodge employee told her, then it means he's from here. And if he's from here, it means he's still here. Claire took the 2008 still and the 1991 photograph to a forensic image analyst. They overlaid the frames, adjusted for grain and scale, and compared the proportions. The analyst couldn't say they were definitively the same person, but he couldn't rule it out either. The posture, the slope of the shoulders, the estimated height, all consistent. It was enough for Claire to believe she wasn't chasing 2 stories, she was chasing one. When she told Henry about the 2008 case, he didn't look surprised. I always wondered, he said quietly, staring out the window at the snow-dusted street, whether it had happened before or after, whether it was something that belonged to this town. He didn't ask to see the new photograph. He didn't need to. He had already spent 30 years with the older one burned into his mind. The discovery changed the tone of the investigation. It wasn't just about what had happened to David and Lila anymore. It was about the possibility that Grayford had been living with something or someone that took without pattern, without leaving trace, and without fear of being caught. And as Claire dug deeper, she began to notice something else. Both events had taken place not far from the lake, and both had happened under a waning moon. The negatives arrived at the state crime lab in a flat padded envelope marked "Handle with care." They were accompanied by a note in Claire's precise handwriting: possible suspect in long-term linked disappearances. Original capture, July 1991. Photographer Henry Calloway. The lab's imaging team was used to seeing decades-old evidence, but film that had been kept in stable dry storage for 30 years was rare. The strips were clean, the emulsion intact, when they were fed into the high-resolution scanner. Every grain of silver halide bloomed into clarity on the monitor. The first pass was to sharpen the outline of the figure between the sedan's edges emerged that had once been lost, to blur the distinct curve of a shoulder, seemed the faint shadow under a hat brim, a faint gleam of metal caught in the light. Right where the figure's hand should be, the analyst, a man named Alvarez, zoomed in further. The pixels resolved into the shape of a ring, not a wedding band. The band was thicker set with a single dark stone. The style was distinctive, the kind often passed down through families. Claire knew at once this was more than an accessory. Rings were identifiers. Rings could be traced, but it wasn't the only new detail the scan revealed. In the far right corner of the frame, reflected in the glass of a sedan's rear window, was the faint, warped image of the bride. It wasn't the smiling Lila from the string-light photographs. This Lila looked over her shoulder, her mouth slightly open, as if she were mid-sentence, speaking to someone behind her. Behind her reflection, another shape, smaller, bent low, the vague curve of a face, partly obscured. It was impossible to tell if it belonged to the figure between the sedans or someone else entirely. The second image, the champagne toast, was also sharper in the scan. What had once been a smear of darkness in the open doorway was now a discernible form. The silhouette had depth, shoulders turned slightly as though leaning in, the angle of the head tilted down like someone listening. Alvarez enhanced the contrast, and the outline of a long coat came into view. That detail stood out. It had been a warm night, humid. Even no one else in the reception photos wore anything heavier than a suit jacket. Claire carried the printed enlargements to Henry's house. That evening, the old man sat at the kitchen table, his breathing shallow, his sweater hanging loose on his frame. When he saw the ring, he leaned back slowly in his chair. His eyes went distant, as if pulling something from far away. "I've seen that ring before," he said. His voice was quiet, almost unwilling. "Not on the night of the wedding. Years before, my father used to know a man who wore one just like it. It had belonged to his father before him." "Blackstone silver band." Claire asked for a name. Henry hesitated. "It won't matter if it's him. He's dead, been dead for years." The reflection in the car window unsettled Henry more. He stared at it for a long time, his lips pressed into a thin line. "She's talking to someone," he murmured. "I always thought she just looked startled. But she's speaking." He didn't say what both of them were thinking, that if they could read her lips, they might know the last words she ever said. Claire took the enlargements to a lip-reading specialist, a retired speech therapist who now worked with law enforcement. The woman studied the reflection for hours, replaying it in high contrast, slowed frame by frame. Finally, she turned to Claire. "She's saying 2 words." The woman said. "What are they?" The woman hesitated. "She says not here." The words cracked something open in Claire's mind. Not here. It implied a plan, or at least an understanding between Lila and whoever she was speaking to. It didn't sound like fear, it sounded like caution. If that was true, the disappearance might not have been entirely random. Claire returned to Henry with the phrase. He sat quietly, his fingers tracing the grain of the table. "She was always the careful one," he said finally. "If she said not here, it was because she was planning to go somewhere else, somewhere she thought was safer." He didn't add the obvious. "She never made it there that night." Claire filed her notes and pinned 2 images to the corkboard in her motel room, the 1991 photograph and the 2008 still. The figure between the sedans loomed in both, and now the gleam of the ring caught her eye in each. The idea that this person had moved through Grayford for decades unchallenged was almost too much to hold in her head. The truth was in the grain, but the grain only told part of the story. The rest, the motive, the path, the ending, was still somewhere in the shadows. The man came forward quietly. It was late February, and Claire was packing to leave Grayford for a week when the call came from the sheriff's office. A 72-year-old named Thomas Greer had walked in that morning and said he wanted to speak about the wedding case. By the time Claire arrived, Greer was seated in a small interview room, his hands folded neatly on the table. His hair was thin, his skin weathered like old leather, but his eyes were steady. "I know what happened to them," he said before she could even sit down. The recorder clicked on. Claire leaned forward to David and Lila Harrow. Greer nodded once, and the others. Her pulse quickened. "Others, the couple in 2008, he said. "And before them too. You don't think those 2 were the first, do you?" The room seemed to shrink. "Tell me," Claire said. Greer took a slow breath. "I can't tell you where they are, and I won't tell you who took them." Claire stared at him. "Then what exactly are you confessing to?" "I'm confessing to knowing," he said simply. "Over the Next hour, Greer spoke in a way that circled the truth without ever stepping directly on it. He described seeing meetings late at night in the woods near the Murren figures gathering quietly. He claimed these meetings went back decades, and that the people involved were respected in the town, men and women who would never be suspected. It wasn't about killing, Greer said. Not at first. It was about keeping people quiet, getting rid of the ones who knew too much or wouldn't go along. Claire asked what the Newlyweds could possibly have known. Greer's lips pressed into a thin line. Sometimes people see something they shouldn't, even if they don't realize what they've seen. Yet he refused to name names, but his hints were unsettling. A family still living in town, an old property near the lake no longer in use, a man with a black stone ring who was dead now, but left his habits behind. When Claire pressed for details about the ring, Greer looked at her, as if gauging how much she already knew. You've seen it, haven't you? He said. By the end of the interview, she had pages of notes, but no location, no names, nothing that could break the case open. Greer claimed the one still alive would burn the whole town down before letting the truth surface. Why come forward now? She asked finally. He smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. Because I don't have long left, and when I go, I don't want to be the only one still carrying it. The sheriff considered him unreliable, possibly delusional, but Claire knew the difference between a man making up stories and a man protecting something. Greer wasn't lying. He was withholding. She left the station with the sick understanding that sometimes in cases like this, a confession was worse than silence, because it gave you just enough truth to taste, but never enough to swallow. That night, she called Henry. He didn't answer. She left a message telling him about Greer's statement, about the mention of the ring, about the shadow of something larger than two isolated disappearances. When she hung up, she realized she'd said something she hadn't meant to. She'd referred to the vanishings as the first and the second, which meant she was already thinking there could be a third. Snowmelt ran in thin rivulets down Main Street, pooling in the dips of the cracked asphalt. Winter in Grayford was giving way to a raw, wet spring, the kind where the air smelled faintly of mud and wood smoke. Claire stayed in town longer than she planned, not because she thought Greer would change his mind, she knew he wouldn't, but because she couldn't shake the feeling that the story wasn't finished yet. Henry's health had declined sharply in the weeks since she'd first shown him the enhanced photographs. When she visited, the blinds in his living room were always drawn halfway, letting in just enough light to catch the edges of the framed photographs on the walls. None of them were from that night, the last time she saw him. The metal box set open on the table between them. I don't think he'll be here much longer, Henry said quietly. His hands trembled as he ran a finger over the glossy surface of the parking lot print. You should keep them now, all of them. Claire hesitated. Henry, once I publish this, you know it won't just be a story. Any more people here will be angry, maybe worse. He gave a tired smile. If it brings them closer to the truth, they can be as angry as they want. She didn't tell him she doubted it would bring anyone closer. Sometimes the truth was something people saw and still refused to believe. 2 weeks later, Henry Calloway was gone. The town's notice in the paper called him a devoted son of Grayford and a man who captured our happiest moments. There was no mention of the negatives, no mention of the wedding, no hint that had carried the weight of 2 missing lives, maybe more, for 3 decades. Claire attended the small funeral. She saw the way people avoided looking at her, the way conversations stopped. When she stepped into the diner later that day, she was no longer just a visitor. She was the person asking questions people had trained themselves not to answer. She left Grayford with the box in the trunk of her car in her apartment back in Pittsburgh. She spread the photographs across her floor. The prints lay in neat rows, the timeline unfolding like a film strip. The champagne toast, the string lights, the parking lot, the ring, the reflection in the glass. It struck her that the most haunting parts weren't the faces or the shadows, it was the space between them, the unlit air, the stretches of pavement, the gap between 2 parked cars. Those empty spaces were where the story lived. That was the problem with absence. The mind filled it in, and it never stopped filling. Months later, her article was published. It didn't name names, it didn't accuse, it laid out the facts, the parallels between 1991 and 2008, the enhanced details and the negatives. It ended with Greer's words, "I'm confessing to knowing," and a photograph of the lake at dusk. The reaction was muted in Grayford. Some said it was a good piece of writing, some said it was a smear job, and some didn't say anything at all. The sheriff's office officially stated that the case remained open. Unofficially, Claire knew nothing would change. She kept in touch with a few people in town. The calls were irregular, often short, but in the autumn, she got one that froze her mid-sentence. It was from a woman who worked at Rubus Diner "We had a wedding here last night," the woman said, her voice low out at the lodge. Claire waited. The bride and groom left just after midnight hand in hand, haven't been seen since that night. She pulled the parking lot photograph from its envelope and set it on her desk. She studied the blurred figure, the gleam of the ring, the reflection in the glass. The negative space seemed larger now. It felt like a doorway back in Grayford, in the diner, where Henry's framed wedding photographs still hung. There was one image that no one ever took down: David and Lila dancing under the string lights, their faces warm with the glow of the night. People looked at it and remembered the way the music sounded, the way the roses smelled, the way the fairy lights hummed faintly overhead. And maybe somewhere in their minds they also remembered the way the shadows moved just beyond the reach of that light. Some stories end with a revelation. This one didn't. It ended with a photograph. And in that photograph, the truth remained not in what was seen, but in what was missing.